Good evening and welcome to our special election coverage. The exit polls are now in, offering the first nationwide snapshot of voter sentiment in today's local elections. For a closer look at what the numbers reveal, we turn to our Kim Bo-kyung first. Bo-kyung.
Tammy, I'm here at Arirang's Extended Reality XR studio. Let's take a closer look at the voter turnout first. Starting with how many people have voted by 5 p.m. Data from the National Election Commission shows that an estimated 57.4% of the country's eligible voters, that is, those born on or before June 4, 2008, have voted in the election. That means 25,617,431 people out of the 44,649,908 eligible voters have cast their ballots. In each of the past 5 elections, voter turnout has exceeded the 50% mark. The highest turnout over the past 2 decades was recorded in 2018 during the 7th local elections, when more than 60% of eligible voters cast their ballots. The most recent elections saw the lowest turnout, finishing just about 50%. Currently is 57.4%, having surpassed previous local elections voter turnout already at 3 p.m. Eyes are now on whether it will surpass 60%. Now, looking at the regional voter turnout. Out of the country's 16 provinces and cities, Jeollanam-do province showed the highest voter turnout with 63.6%. But if you combine Gwangju City, as they are set to launch the integrated Gwangju-Jeonnam special metropolitan city, the rate stands at 58.4%. The next in line with the highest voter turnout is Gangwon-do province with 61.9%, followed by Jeollabuk-do province with 60.2%. The lowest voter turnout was recorded in Jeju Island with 53.8%. Now let's take a look at the exit polls by public broadcaster KBS. The poll results show that the Democratic Party of Korea was projected to win 14 key races for mayors and provincial governors against the People Power Party's 2. 4 regions are reportedly in tight race, but currently Democratic Party of Korea is leading. Let's specifically take a look at the exit polls for key battleground areas. First of all, for Seoul City Mayor, the Democratic Party of Korea's Chung Won-ho is going up against the People Power Party's Oh Se-eun, with Chung Won-ho in the lead. Then we have Daegu City, where the Democratic Party of Korea's Kim Boo-kyum is in competition with the People Power Party's Chu Kyung-ho. Currently, the exit poll says Chu Kyung-ho is in the lead with 49.9%, but the race is very tight. Turning to the race in Busan City, the Democratic Party of Korea's Jeon Jae-soo is going up against the People Power Party's Park Hyung-jun for mayor. And Jeon Jae-soo is ahead of Park Hyung-jun right now with 50.2%. Moving on to Gyeonggi-do, the nation's most populous province, the Democratic Party of Korea's Choo Mi-ae is going up against the People Power Party's Yang Hyang-ja for governor. And Choo Mi-ae is poised for a clear victory for now. For Incheon Mayor, the Democratic Party of Korea's Park Chan-dae is going up against the People Power Party's Yoo Jung-bok, and Park Chan-dae has the upper hand with 53.7%. When it comes to the Ulsan City Mayor position, the Democratic Party of Korea's Kim Sang-wook is going up against the People Power Party's Kim Do-kyum, and Kim Sang-wook is in the lead. Turning to Sejong, the Democratic Party of Korea's Cho Sang-woo is going up against the People Power Party's Choi Min-woo for mayor, and Cho Sang-woo holds the big advantage at the moment. Moving on to the Daejeon mayoral race, the Democratic Party of Korea's Heo Tae-jung is going up against the People Power Party's Lee Jang-woo, and according to the exit poll, Heo Tae-jung currently holds the edge. Turning to the Jeonnam-Gwangju City governor race, the Democratic Party of Korea's Min Young-bae is competing against the People Power Party's Lee Jung-hyun, and Min Young-bae appears to be leading quite significantly. In Gangwon Province, the Democratic Party of Korea's Woo Sang-woo is facing up against the People Power Party's Kim Jin-tae, and Woo Sang-woo is projected to come out on top based on the exit poll with 51.3%. In the Gyeongsang-Bukdo Province race, the Democratic Party of Korea's Oh Jun-gi is running against the People Power Party's Lee Chol-woo, and Lee Chol-woo has the significant lead with 69.7%. Turning to Gyeongsang-Namdo Province, the Democratic Party of Korea's Kim Kyung-soo is competing against the People Power Party's Park Won-soo, with Kim Kyung-soo enjoying an advantage at this stage. In the race for Chungcheon-Bukdo governor, the Democratic Party of Korea's Shin Yong-han is taking on the People Power Party's Kim Myung-hwan, and Shin Yong-han has established an early lead. Turning to Chungcheon-Namdo Province, the Democratic Party of Korea's Park Soo-hyun is facing off against the People Power Party's Kim Tae-eum for governor, with Park Soo-hyun emerging as the front runner with 52.1%. Finally, on Jeju Island, the Democratic Party of Korea's Ri Sung-gun is competing against the People Power Party's Moon Sung-yu for governor, and Ri Sung-gun appears to be leading based on the exit poll with 62.2%. Moving on to the by-elections. Out of 14 local districts where by-elections are taking place, we need to take a look at 3 major areas. First, in Pyeongtaek-B, the Democratic Party of Korea's Kim Yong-nam is competing against the People Power Party's Yoo Hee-dong and Rebuilding Korea Party's Jo Guk. Jo Guk is currently leading according to the exit poll, but it is indeed a tight race. Finally, in the Busan-Buk-A by-election, the Democratic Party of Korea's Ha Jung-woo is running against the People Power Party's Bang Min-sik, and independent candidate Han Dong-un, with Ha Jung-woo out in front according to the exit poll, but in a tight race against Han Dong-un. This is the current race at this hour. I'll be back in our later newscast for more updates. Back to you, Tammy.
So exit polls may only be projections, but they're already shaping the mood of election night. We are now taking a look at the first reactions from party headquarters as supporters and candidates take in the results. Just moments after the results were released earlier at 6 p.m. here in Korea, emotions ran high at campaign headquarters where supporters and candidates closely watched the numbers coming in. Now, it looks, there appears to be a sense of relief inside the ruling party situation room at the moment, given that this election has widely been viewed as a midterm assessment of the administration, the current administration. The ruling party seems encouraged by the early projections. Now, that said, with the actual vote count still ahead, party officials, at the same time, they look excited but appear cautious and also stopping short of declaring victory just yet. Now, on the other hand, the main opposition, People Power Party, they seem relatively calm compared to the ruling party. The release of these exit poll results within the ruling party sparking, applause and cheers at the ruling camp. Now, the leaders at the ruling party are likely to view these projections as a sign that voters support a stronger belief and confidence on the current Lee Jae-myung administration. Now, still, we are seeing more cheers and applause from the ruling party, but we do have to remind our viewers that some gaps are still remaining within or near the margin of error. So both sides are still closely watching the numbers, as these numbers are just exit poll results, early projections, Now, at this point, neither camp appears to be in a position to feel, completely confident about the outcome. There is still every possibility that the race could shift as the actual vote count gets underway tonight. And apparently, the vote count hasn't started yet. So Based on these early projections, the both ruling and opposition parties are showing some contrasting reactions. Now, the reactions are understandably mixed, a combination of, relief, excitement, and at the same time, lingering uncertainty. Even where there are cheers, many recognize that the final outcome will ultimately be determined by the votes now being counted very soon. And as the exit poll results begin to sink in, let us head to the headquarters of the two major parties for a closer look at the mood on the ground. Our political correspondents Moon Hae-ryun and An Sung-jin join us live from the respective party headquarters. Hae-ryun, let us start with you at the ruling party headquarters. How are party officials reacting to the exit poll results at the moment?
That's right, Tammy. So I'm currently standing in the Democratic Party Situation Room, which has been set up in the National Assembly's Members' Office building. And although it's quite calm behind me right now, as we just saw earlier, the atmosphere was considerably more electric immediately following the exit polls. And the party had flagged 6 regions to watch tonight, including Seoul, Busan, Ulsan, and Daegu, and Gyeongsang-namdo and Jeollabuk-do provinces. So when the exit poll suggested the party was on course to take the majority of those battlegrounds, the relief in this room was palpable. The biggest reaction came with Seoul, the headline race of the night, where exit polls put the Democratic Party's candidate Jung Won-ho ahead and the room erupted. But the applause continued as more favorable results came in from traditionally conservative strongholds like Busan and Gyeongsang-namdo province, results that, if they hold, would represent a significant breakthrough for the DP. The party leadership, Chairman Chung Cheong-rae and floor leader Han Byung-do, came in just before the exit polls began and joined the celebratory atmosphere. There's also cautious optimism around turnout, which is running roughly 10 percentage points higher than the last local elections 4 years ago, a figure the party is reading as a good sign. But it's still early, and party officials here are quick to stress that they'll be watching the count closely as results come in through the night. And that's all I have for now, but I'll be back in a later newscast with more updates. Back to you, Tammy.
All right, there's that from the ruling party for now. Sung-jin, let's bring you in now from the PPP headquarters over in Yeouido. How would you describe the atmosphere in the Situation Room there at this hour?
Right. Good afternoon or good evening, Tammy. I must say it's been around 30 minutes since the exit polls were released at 6 p.m. And the mood here has shifted noticeably once the numbers appeared on the screen, with a heavy silence following over the party's election situation room. Now, party officials who had been cautiously optimistic throughout the day were met with a sobering projection as the exit polls project the People Power Party leading in only one of the 60 metropolitan and gubernatorial races. According to the exit polls, the party managed to hold on to only one of its traditional strongholds, Daegu, which is still considered as a competitive race. But the results were more disappointing in key battleground regions. Busan, Daegu, Jeollabuk-do province, Gangwon-do province still remain as closely contested areas. The party's senior officials, including Chairman Jang Dong-hyuk, just left the Situation Room with much disappointment on his face. Before polls closed at 6 p.m., chaos over a ballot shortage has left voters stranded in some polling situations and polling stations in Korea. Now, the PPP had earlier demanded a full investigation, calling on the National Election Commission to guarantee every single citizen waiting in line to able to cast their ballots. Now, this outcome falls short of expectations within the party, which had hoped a late surge in conservative voter turnout could translate into victories across several of these competitive regions. Now, that's all I have for now, but I will be back with more updates for our later newscast.
That was our correspondent An Sung-jin at the main opposition People Power Party headquarters. And also, thank you, Hae-ryun and Sung-jin, for the latest updates. So voting officially ended at 6 p.m. here in Korea, and the focus has now shifted from the ballot box to the counting centers. Without a further ado, let's go live to our Jo Young-in, who is standing by at a ballot counting center here in Seoul. Young-in.
Good evening, Tommy. I'm currently standing at a ballot counting station set up at Seoul National University in southern Seoul, one of the 258 counting venues in Korea. Behind me, you can see rows of counting tables set up as official voting ended at 6 p.m. There is still a lot of sense of tension here as counting staff are waiting for ballot counting to begin. The atmosphere here is predicted to get busy as ballot boxes arrive from polling station, with some 117,000 counting staff mobilized nationwide. Ballot counting is set to begin soon and will need some time to have a clear outline of the counting rates. The first results are expected to be released around 7:30 p.m., but there will be differences depending on the region. The National Election Commission predicts early projection of winners could begin emerging by midnight.
It is going to be a long night, Young. And now for those watching at home, could you explain how the ballot counting process works and what safeguards are being implemented to ensure an accurate and also transparent count?
Right. Once ballot boxes arrive under police escort and the election observers, officials first inspect the boxes for any irregularities, checking whether the ballot boxes are properly sealed. The boxes are then opened, the ballots are organized and put into sorting machines, which conduct an initial classification of valid ballots and candidates. Afterwards, officials manually inspect each ballot one by one, making sure the ballots are correctly counted with no invalid ballots, before going through the final rounds of verification. The additional hand counting process introduced during the general elections 2 years ago is now being applied to local elections as well. Ballot counting is expected to take longer than it did 4 years ago. That's all I have for now, but I'll be back with updates. Back to you, Dami.
That was our To Young-eun live from a ballot counting center in Seoul. Thank you for the coverage, Young-eun. While the actual vote count is still hasn't started yet, early projections are already raising important questions. What do they tell us about the public mood? Which regions proved decisive? And what could tonight's results mean for the country's political future? For more, we now turn to Professor Mason Ricci tonight. Welcome, Professor Ricci.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Why don't we start with your overall assessment of these exit poll results we just watched?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, of course, is that these are just projections. We don't have the votes counted yet, so we should, of course, be circumspect in what we think.
Right.
When I was on earlier today, before the exit polls came out, I was asked sort of what would constitute a big victory for the Democratic Party, and I said, 11 or 12 of the major 16 governorships and mayor races going DP would be a good start. I think they probably need to get Seoul. Busan would be nice. Winning Daegu or Daegu being extremely close would also be a victory, and then defending most of their 13 by-election seats. And it looks like right now what we're seeing is that it's trending in that direction. We see it looks like 14 right now of the major races have been called or projected to go towards the DP. And several of those, 4 or 5, are probably too close to call. It looks like the PPP right now is only slated to win 1 definitively. So if things hold, you're going to have a very blue map in South Korea going forward. So that's the first sort of overall thing. Of course, it looks like Chong is likely to win Seoul, again, based on the projections so far, which, of course, I said is a sort of absolute minimum, I think, for the DP to really claim a decisive victory.
Right.
When you're looking at the turnout numbers, 57.4% currently, will edge up close to 60. So we're already well above where we've been, all except for 2018 in terms of turnout. And most people thought that the higher the turnout would be, probably the better that would be for the DP, which seems to be the case right now. And so I think what you've got is that the DP is supporting their party, they're supporting their president, and the PPP is fractured, and probably some of their voters have chosen to stay home. So it's really, in some sense, not a huge surprise.
Many observers describe this election as the first nationwide, political test of the Lee Jae-myung administration. Now, based on your answer just now, I guess these exit poll numbers are suggesting that voters are giving, a sense of confidence to the current government rather than sending a warning signal.
It seems to be, again, maybe I should say just every answer is going to start with the same thing, which is these are just projections. We don't have the final numbers yet.
It's going to take hours.
But at least for what we're seeing right now, yeah, I think essentially two things are true simultaneously. The PPP is fractured and in disarray, and they're having difficulty motivating their voters because they don't have a coherent message. We can come back to that. But looking at the DP, who seem to be the winners coming out of this, they sort of ran, I think, on 4 planks. The first of which is Lee Jae-myung sitting at roughly 60% popularity a year into his mandate as president is an historic high. And even though in some sense, weirdly enough, Lee Jae-myung is not personally popular, his presidency is popular. So they seem to be running on that. They ran on a democratic restoration message after the martial law in 2024, and that continues to resonate, I think, especially because the PPP hasn't really gotten out of that crisis yet, and to the extent they have, it was too little too late. They've been, of course, the DP running on pocketbook issues, affordability, and housing issues and things like that, and so, again, those are things that are important in local elections, and they've tried at least to position themselves as, the sort of party of, economic and social justice in that regard. And then Lee Jae-myung, of course, has consistently, as well as his party, consistently referred to their foreign policy as being pragmatic, both with respect to Washington, but also China and Japan and the rest of the world, and the summitry and all of the meetings and the things that have taken place in terms of the meetings between Trump and Lee, I think have given him something to run on in terms of foreign policy, and I think that's been relatively successful.
He has had a busy year on the diplomatic front. Now, with that being said, is it safe to say that this election was about evaluating the government's performance, or would you say, national issues or candidates were more at the forefront over national politics?
Yeah, certainly it's impossible to deny that if these numbers hold, that clearly a significant portion of the voting public has decided that they're willing to sort of check the box and say, for right now, we're willing to continue to let the Democratic Party do their thing. I mean, this would, functionally speaking, be giving them sort of plenary power. They would have the presidency under Lee Jae-myung, the National Assembly majority, a significant one, and now many of the governorships and important mayors posts. That's a huge amount of power. I would argue, by the way, that that's one of the things that the PPP was correct, I think, in running on substantively, which is that perhaps the DP is starting to get too much power. And that, as we say, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that you need a functional counterweight. But unfortunately, the problem is the PPP is a very imperfect messenger of democratic accountability because they never really, frankly, overcame or even showed adequate remorse, much less reform, after the martial law incident. So they're a very imperfect messenger in terms of being a democratic counterweight to potential power overreach by Lee Jae-myung and the Democratic Party. And the party is fractured, and it's unable to motivate its voters to go out. And in many respects, the PPP doesn't have a very positive-looking message. It has a very backward-looking message and a very internally facing set of divisions, I think, that are really something that the voters punished, seemingly, by the numbers that we've seen so far during this local election.
Unfortunately, that is one of the weaknesses and hurdles that the PPP still has to overcome at the moment. Now, Professor Ricci, there are so many key battlegrounds, Seoul-mayor, Busan, Daegu, and these areas are turning out to be in tight races. Which area do you think proved to be decisive when it comes to the outcome at the moment, based on the early projections?
Of course, yeah. The first thing I noticed, it seems like the DP's probably going to walk away with Busan. As I said, Seoul, I think, was already trending that way. Oh Se-hoon, I think, was a weakened candidate. He was relatively good, I think, among the PPP for dealing with the martial law issue, and I think he was actually a relatively good messenger for that democratic accountability message, but I think he was weighed down by the larger problems of the party, of course. And then, recently the overpass collapse, the Hangang Bridge, the Hangang bus problems have, I think, hurt him a little bit. And the housing message, perhaps, that he had didn't resonate quite the way that he would have liked. But looking beyond, looking beyond Seoul, Busan, looks like it may go DP. That's a big deal. And really, I think perhaps the thing that's clearest of all is how close Daegu was. And that's, of course, that's the stronghold for the Conservatives. And even if they end up winning it, the fact that it's going to be so close indicates that, frankly speaking, their people didn't come out to vote. And so, the message one would hope in the party is going to be loud and clear, and that is that they need to reform and move on and come back with a positive looking message for the future.
Right, Daegu is turning out to be a huge variable. Chugyong versus Kim Bu-kyung, since Kim Bu-kyung, they're also saying they've also garnered 49.9 and 49.1. That is the closest race that we've seen in this election.
Yeah, it's a huge result, obviously, for the DP, even if they don't end up winning it.
Right. Well, Professor Ricci, I do have to ask you this a broad question. If these results are confirmed based on these early projections, what impact do you expect to see in the political landscape here in Korea?
Yeah. So, obviously, the Democratic Party will continue on the path that it's on. Lee Jae-myung and the Democratic Party will consolidate political power. This will open the door for them to do a lot of things domestically, I think, with a sort of free hand or a sort of free mandate. We'll probably see fewer shuffling of deck chairs in the ministries because there won't be quite as much pressure for reform. I think, of course, some people will. There's a sort of natural break point that as we go into fall, will be a year and a half, year to year and a half after the beginning of his mandate. You'll begin to see some shuffling in some of the ministries and in some of the offices in the presidential office. You'll see some shifting there, but probably not as much as if there had been a more difficult race or a more difficult outcome for the Democratic Party. And then on the PPP side, I think one would hope, I guess, that this will lead to the reckoning and the reform that has to happen within that party. I think one of the interesting things to sort of look at is what's going to happen to Han Dong-hoon. Right now, he's down by a percentage point in the by-election in the Busan district. And if he manages to come back and win that, I think that you could see some of the reformists in the PPP say, look, Han Dong-hoon, who used to be in the PPP, of course, but is now running as an independent, he won his race on a sort of forward-looking platform that moved on from Yoon Suk-yeol and the sort of traditional conservatives. We need to do that as a PPP as well. If he doesn't win, will the message from within the PPP sort of Yoon hardliners be, see, Han Dong-hoon wasn't able to win either. We need to continue the course and play hardball the way that we have with the Lee Jae-myung administration up until now. So that's a race that I'll be looking at in particular in terms of the results.
Well, according to my colleague Cho Young-in, apparently ballots are slowly arriving at ballot counting centers here in South Korea. So the vote counting has already begun or is about to begin. And Professor Ricci, what's the key number or trend our viewers should keep an eye on tonight?
Yeah, I think one of the important things to look at will be how many of the by-election seats that the DP manages to hang on to. 13 of the 14 seats that were up were most recently held by a Democratic Party member of the National Assembly. So how many of those they manage to hold, I think, matters. One of the interesting things will be, of course, the Chokuk race, rebuilding Korea in Pyeongtaek, which is exceedingly tight right now with 3 candidates, roughly around 30%.
Very
Chokuk
tight.
with a small lead. If he wins that, obviously that's one less seat that's in the Democratic Party hands. It's Chokuk's obviously in some sense aligned with the left side of the political spectrum, but nonetheless that wouldn't be a Democratic Party seat per se. And if any of the results come in for some of these other races that maybe take a seat or two away from the Democratic Party, that would at least be something small that the PPP could take away. I'm really looking, I think, at in terms of numbers, obviously, how big the victory is going to be for candidate Chung here in Seoul if he ends up winning. I think obviously the bigger the margin of victory he has here, the worse the sign is, I think, for the PPP. Obviously the number in Gyeonggi province was significant. So one of the things that I'll be interested to see there is whether or not in the Gyeonggi province, candidate Chu manages to stay above 60%, which again would I think be quite a significant number for her as well. So I'm looking at that, and then of course, ultimately, like I said, I'm looking at Daegu and Busan. I mean,
Yeah.
these are conservative strongholds, and I guess the number there is 50% plus one. Whoever in those cities can get to the 50% plus one mark and end up winning those races, I think we'll be able to contribute to a very interesting narrative with respect to how the regionalization of politics this time has perhaps been overturned a little bit compared to the past. Largely, I think, because of the after effects of the martial law. I don't think necessarily that these trends will hold in the next election or the next presidential election, but at least this go around, the martial law continues to be an impactful event on the national political scene here as much as on the local scene as well.
Well, let us see how close these early projections turn out to be tonight. Professor Ricci, thanks for coming in tonight as always.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
집값도 사실 수도권 가격이 너무 높은 편이고 주거도 대부분 수도권에 포진되어 있는 편인데 이걸 조금 가격을 조정을 하고 지방에도 살 수 있도록 인프라를 구축해주는 게 맞지 않나 생각을 하고 있습니다.
일단 일자리를 늘리는 게 중요하다고 생각해서 그 지역 내에 있는 고용을 창출하냐 못하냐 좀 그런 것들을 중점으로 보고 있습니다.
일단 지금 금전적인 거는 많이 해주시는데 일단 돌봄이나 이제 아기 같으면 교육이나 이런 게 일단 서울이나 대구는 좀 너무 많이 차이 나서 조금 뭐 평준화 시켰으면은 좋을 것 같아요.
그리고 우리 종합병원이 하나 있었으면 좋겠어요. 부여는. 예, 저 대전까지 나가야 되고 그리고 이런 사람 다리 이렇게 불편한 사람은 누가 싫어다지 하고 모든 게 불편한 거 많아요.
인기 있는 정책 말고 좀 더 길게 보고 혹시나 이번에 당선되신 분 그 다음에 어떤 분이 오더라도 조금 더 연속성 있는 정책이었으면 좋겠습니다.
That wraps up our coverage for now. We'll be back at 9 p.m. Korea time with the latest election developments and vote count updates. I'm Kim Dami. Thanks for watching.
It feels a bit off.